And then, okay, so I'm gonna go off camera and now I'll be opening the room. So the participants will start joining.
Welcome. We begin by respectfully acknowledging that we are hosting today from the traditional territories and ancestral lands of the Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on the cultural importance of these lands as we honor those who have walked before us along with those still to come, and to reaffirming our commitment to forging culturally safe relationships on our pathway towards reconciliation. Please join me in also acknowledging the Indigenous culture of knowledge sharing that leverages collective experiences and allows people to learn from one another. It is in that spirit of mutual respect and collaboration that we come together today. We would like to thank all of the dedicated college members, health workers, industry partners, and leaders who are working diligently to manage and lead through the COVID-19 pandemic. Your efforts and ongoing commitment are seen, felt, and appreciated. Today's CCHL webinar emerged because of a special sponsored issue of Healthcare Management Forum. It was volume 34, issue 5, in September of 2021, in which Dr. Cantor contributed the article Modern Technologies Communications, an essential tool for optimizing hospital operations and improving outcomes. Like this article, the webinar has been sponsored by Vocera. It is my pleasure to welcome the Chief Medical Information Officer and author, Dr. Benjamin Cantor, to speak to the communication and collaboration platform. Dr. Cantor is the Chief Medical Information Officer at Vocera, where he works closely with clinicians and engineers to co-design the next generation of real-time communication and collaboration solutions for hospitals and health systems. Prior to joining Vocera, Dr. Cantor worked as an industry consultant and thought leader with several innovative healthcare IT companies. Dr. Cantor earned his medical degree and completed internal medicine training at Northwestern University. He completed postdoctoral studies in both pulmonary disease and critical care medicine at the UCSD Medical Center in California. Dr. Cantor is board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary disease, and medical informatics. Over to you, Dr. Cantor.
All right, Don, thank you. Very much appreciate your role as facilitator and to the Canadian College of Healthcare Leaders. Thank you very much. And to all of the invisible audience that I'm unable to see, thank you for taking time out of your day to join me. As per the title, the focus of my presentation will be on the new communication and collaboration systems, which are known as CC&C for clinical communication collaboration, and how by improving information flow, they enable smart hospitals. Now, I've been working in medical informatics, either full or part-time, for the better part of the past 20 years. In 2007, I was Chief of Staff, Chief Medical Information Officer, and a member of my hospital system's executive management team. And if I can get my slide to advance, there we go. All right, and a small piece of a large and audacious project. Build a brand new state-of-the-art medical campus in a San Diego suburb, a true hospital of the future, which opened its doors 5 years later in 2012. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of this story. Palomar Medical Center was a project that had its genesis in a seismic hospital retrofit mandate that was passed by the state of California in response to the 1994 Northridge earthquake. In our case, it made much more sense to develop a new medical center on undeveloped land rather than to retrofit an existing facility. So we had a true greenfield opportunity. In 2007, our community in Southern California passed a $500 million bond measure to provide seed capital for this project. We knew that the process of clearing the site and building the hospital would take approximately 5 years. And so we convened an expert outside panel to ensure that as we planned and built the new facility, it wouldn't be obsolete by the time it was open. As you can imagine, trying to predict the impact of rapidly changing technologies on the delivery of healthcare is a tough job, particularly when you're looking 5 years out. And this is the final project, a 69,000 square meter community hospital, which opened with 288 staff beds. Our health system serves an urban and rural community spread out over approximately 2,100 kilometers. The hospital's emergency department, for a scale, sees a little bit over 100,000 visitors each year. And as I mentioned, we opened in late summer of 2012, and this was the view of the area 1 year later. As a wildfire spread from a community to the west of Escondido, where we're located, and driven inland by coastal winds, headed right towards the new hospital, which you can see in the circle there. Located adjacent to the medical center's campus is Stone Brewery. That's the largest and most well-known producer of Southern California beer, known for its very hoppy pale ale. Both the hospital and the brewery survived the fire without damage, a fact that was obviously welcomed by our community, but I'm not certain that my neighbors were happier about the hospital surviving or the brewery. For our purposes, I've called out a few of the large number of awards which were attributed to the Hospital of the Future project. In 2012, it was named the #1 healthcare project in the US, and in 2014 was ranked as the 3rd most technologically advanced hospital in the country and 5th in the world. Finally, in 2014, it was also named to the list of the 20 most beautiful hospitals in the United States. Now, whether one believes their own press or not, the hospital remains by all accounts very successful. So how are we able to accomplish something like this in a suburban community? Well, one of our guiding principles that led to the development was consideration of what's known as evidence-based design. And to quote from Blair Sadler, a senior fellow at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and a fellow San Diegan, evidence-based design can be defined as the process of basing decisions about the built environment on credible research to achieve the best possible outcomes. Well, what does this translate to in practice? It means that the building itself is a form of technology, and so the design of the building impacts the health and well-being of the patients and staff who inhabit it, and it also may constrain or dictate which technologies are needed to operationalize it. So here's a real-world example that stems from one of the challenges we encountered. One of the consequences of our research into evidence-based design led to a decision that we were going to have a distributed nursing model. This is a very common design today. So at Palomar, there are no traditional centralized nursing stations. When there's no paper records, there's no need to have a central station from which to manage and secure them. And literature showed that safety could be enhanced when nurses were located closer to their patients. In this graphic, each orange dot represents a workstation where physicians and nurses can do their work distributed out by the patient rooms, one between each room. But here's the problem. Nurses and physicians don't work in isolation, right? We work in teams. We depend upon each other. And the old centralized stations gave a place where staff could interact together, where formal and informal transmission of information could take place. So when nurses are distributed, how would we ensure that communications would remain intact? One of the unintended consequences of electronic health records is that they allow clinicians to work from any location at any time. And that can be a very good thing when the physician isn't able to be near the patient's room, but it's a problem when the physicians can work in isolation from the nurses who are providing the immediate care. And so that was one of the challenges that I was asked to focus on as the Chief Medical Information Officer for our organization. My goal, just as we were trying to bring the nurses and patients into closer physical proximity, I wanted to bring the staff into closer technological proximity, to use modern communication technologies to close physical distances and enable efficient care team communications, even if the staff members weren't co-located. But how would we be able to do that without inadvertently causing harm? Literature estimated that nurses were being interrupted roughly 12 to 18 times an hour prior to the advent of smartphones. And interruptions could come from multiple sources, as illustrated here, something I'm sure you're all familiar with. Interruptions, while potentially important because they're transmitting important clinical information or operational information, nevertheless lead to distraction, noise, and can disrupt patient care. Alarm fatigue is but one well-known, one well-recognized consequence. And these interruptions from incessant alerts and alarm notifications, messages, and calls with no context can overload the nurses and physicians, leading to interruption fatigue, cognitive overload, burnout, and medical errors. The care environment becomes increasingly noisy, choppy, maybe chaotic, and obviously to the detriment of both the nurse and the patient. Well, in this digital age, virtually any system hospitals implement can generate alarms, and alarms are really just a clinical decision support message. But instead of ringing a buzzer, these alarms are designed to be sent directly to devices carried by members of the care team. This targeted approach isn't done with malice, but rather to make sure that important information is placed in the hands of the correct person, right, as fast as possible. Most communications traffic in healthcare is event-driven and time-sensitive. An event's taken place that's of sufficient importance that it needs to be brought to the attention of the staff member. And almost invariably, there's a time-sensitive component to the communication. So by sending alarms directly to the nurse, potential sources of delay or outright communication failure are eliminated. The ward clerk, the person who in US hospitals would normally receive and manually triage communications, has been cut out of the process. And unfortunately, these various hospital systems are siloed. They don't talk to each other. So one of the unintended consequences of our data-rich digital age is information overload, alarm fatigue, and an increase in nurse and physician burnout. But if these are problems today, the situation is likely to continue to get worse over the next 5 years. For a moment, just consider the likely impact of the quote-unquote 5G revolution on healthcare. 5G wireless doesn't just enhance our ability to use our personal smartphones. Because of its increased bandwidth and throughput, the shortened latency and improved network efficiencies, medical technologies will absolutely take advantage of it, enabling new forms of monitoring and care. The traffic of information will quickly continue to increase, particularly in the outpatient environment, as acute care moves away from a hospital-centric model to one where the patient encounters take place wherever and whenever needed. Managing this new information flow will not be easy. In the end, each of us, each nurse or physician, has a limited ability to absorb new information while simultaneously providing direct patient care. And to put it in technological terms, each of us has a finite bandwidth. As a result, when considering the impact of digital technologies on the care team, you can't look at the impact of any one system in isolation. Bandwidth is filled by all systems concurrently. There's a cumulative impact. You don't want to overload and burn out your staff, so how is this addressed? Well, at the highest level, let's consider a concept called organizational resilience. The British Standards Institute defines it as an ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond, and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. Now, truly coincidentally, about 2 weeks ago, a timely article was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, which describes resilient organizations as those that rapidly adapt in response to challenges, which enables them to reduce the impact and disruption, leading to a more rapid recovery of normal services. And so here's a key concept. The ability to rapidly respond to areas of operational and clinical friction characterizes those hospitals that successfully navigate crises and is a major factor in what makes an organization resilient. An ability to rapidly convert data from multiple different sources into actionable information is a key determinant of success, and that's embodied in a concept called real-time health systems. organizations that leverage their digital infrastructure to dynamically improve efficiency and outcomes. So we're throwing out a lot of common industry terms, and I want to address two, digital and smart hospitals. In my opinion, the term digital hospital is rather ambiguous. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Certainly no hospital, almost no modern product, from automobiles to homes, are free from some digital underpinnings. Modern cars are essentially computer centers on wheels, but we don't advertise them as digital cars. In hospital, the term used to be synonymous with the fabled paperless hospital, to which a CMIO colleague of mine once famously quipped, "Your hospital will be completely paperless when my bathroom is paperless." Is a hospital digital when it's truly paperless, or when it's simply paperless, uses digital records as an example? Are there no analog systems? And who's to say that a digital system is intrinsically better than an analog one? And so here's an important concept, a second one. Simply being digital, whatever that means, does not make a hospital better or smarter. A patient with a temperature of 38 degrees still has a fever, whether it's measured by an analog or digital thermometer. Smartness is dependent upon how fast you can access data and what you do with it. Improving the flow of information is the key. Smart hospitals continuously derive insight and value from all of their systems, rapidly addressing operational and clinical challenges. Now, the sobering fact is that being digital is simply not enough. Not all digital hospitals are smart, but all smart hospitals will have some digital infrastructure. Smart hospitals have the technology and processes which enable them to think fast and think better. So this is one example of a smart hospital framework that was put forth by the Frost & Sullivan consulting and research firm. And if you look at Frost & Sullivan's framework from the top down, data, which is networked, is churned into information revealing insights. But insights without an ability to take quick action is, well, rather less than optimal, but it's unfortunately common. Smart hospitals leverage technologies to speed the process from information to insight and insight into action. I want to point out and ask you to remember that the representation has three layers, which will be important later: the input layer, a layer deriving insights, and outputs. So now we come back to real-time health system, which is a concept that is extremely similar to a smart hospital. The Gartner Consulting Group has defined the real-time health system as one which uses information and communications technologies to transform the business of care delivery and improve efficiency. In essence, a real-time health system is able to respond rapidly to changing business requirements, care delivery models, financial realities, and the need to improve the patient experience. So the third main point relates to operational and clinical gains, the return on investment, if you will. And these are primarily attributable to the reduction in the time to act. So in my opinion, a general technological vision statement for any state-of-the-art health system might read as follows. Our vision is to create an optimally resilient health system supported by smart institutions using real-time health technologies. I want to stop and let that sink in. Optimal resilience enabled by smart institutions which are able to rapidly respond to areas of operational and clinical friction. And the foundational technology that enables that process, technology without which any such efforts would be hamstrung from the outset, is a modern communication collaboration platform. It's a foundational technology enabling hospitals and health systems to realize value from interoperability among the various systems. Interoperability is not just having an API or an interface. Interoperability is the ability to actually use the data. It provides communication, context, situational awareness, and reporting. CC&C may be considered the engine that creates true interoperability, that great digital mythological beast that we all talk about. If you recall what I discussed earlier, data is being delivered in increasing quantities to staff members, a real perfect storm of good intentions with the nurse as the primary target. Well, what a CC&C platform can do for you is to take that information, rapidly determine whether or not it's actionable, and only if so, to securely distribute that knowledge to the appropriate person or team as quickly as possible. Basically act as, the metaphor would be, an air traffic controller. How's that actually accomplished? We'll take a look at the Vocera CC&C suite. And like the three-tiered Frost and Sullivan model of a smart hospital, our platform begins with inputs, systems providing data. As an example, the platform already has adapters or interfaces for more than 160 hospital systems. This data flows into our central intelligence layer, our middle layer, what we call Engage, where data is turned into information. In this layer of the platform, data from various disparate systems are aggregated and integrated, so the data silos are broken down. And then using rules and logic, data is turned into information, or as Frost and Sullivan termed it, insights. And if it's determined that the information is sufficiently important or actionable, it's routed to the appropriate person or team. All of the messaging and escalation rules, the audit trail, and the reporting information are generated here. Now, at the bottom, you'll see care team now. And Engage, our middle layer, also takes inputs from the care team assignment systems and combines it with the ADT information to create a real-time healthcare team. So which staff members have which responsibilities, which nurses are caring for which patients, as an example. This care team information is crucial to our ability to route information correctly. Finally, that information is routed to one or more staff members and can be delivered to whatever device is most appropriate for that role. So let's walk through a very quick example of the system in operation. And for our purposes, a patient has had a lab result generated from the hospital's lab information system. Well, that information, along with the patient's ADT information for patient location and care team assignment, flow into the Engage middleware layer. And there the information is combined. And if the lab result meets predefined criteria for distribution, is subsequently routed to the person identified as being responsible for that patient, in this case, the patient's primary nurse. But what if that nurse is either unavailable or otherwise doesn't take delivery or review the information? Well, the system is constantly monitoring the time to delivery, the time to read, or the time to acknowledgement. And if the limit is exceeded, then the information is rerouted to another person, in this case, the nurse team leader. This process of escalating the message to one or more people at a time takes place until confirmation of delivery and read have taken place. So instead of a critical lab value being resulted and posted into the electronic health record, and then waiting until someone notices it, or relying on a manual lab process to contact and notify a nurse about a critical value, the system manages the entire process automatically in a matter of seconds. Now, what happens if the nurse, the intended recipient, is not available? Let's assume that the nurse has a patient in trouble and is with the patient and their medical emergency team. The system can become aware of that and uses that information to alter message routing so that when the next message comes in from a different patient, we're not going to interrupt that nurse who's with a high priority patient emergency. We want to not interrupt the folks that have a high priority role at the moment. The information is automatically routed, in this case, to his or her backup. So hence the great importance of knowing as much about the intended recipient of the message as possible. It's not enough to know the context of the patient, although that's a given. We need to know something about the context of the intended recipient, because messaging in the absence of context is rather worthless. To reduce interruptions and improve efficiency, the system has to monitor recipient availability or presence, and then be able to coordinate the communications appropriately. It is as important to know when not to send a message as when to actually do so. I don't want to gloss over something I mentioned earlier because it's important. A true CC&C platform is agnostic as to the mix of communication devices used by your staff members. Each role in a hospital has a unique communication need, and therefore there's an optimal communication device for each role. If your electronic health record or your communication system constrains the mix of devices available to your staff members, you're going to reduce overall communication effectiveness. Systems should be able to support hands-free devices, tablets, personal or enterprise smartphones, desktop systems, and more. And of course, no communication platform would be complete without a smartphone app that can be run on either iOS or Android devices. Our app is called Vena, and it doesn't require a mobile device management solution, although hospitals usually do implement one. Vena gives staff full access to the platform, whether they're using their own personal phone or an enterprise-supplied shared device. Our company is probably best known for our healthcare communication badges, which enable hands-free communication. These devices work through a spoken interface and allow staff members to be reached by name, location, or role, and no phone numbers need to be remembered or used. These devices have been used in hospitals for almost 20 years, but over the past 2 years, they've really been thrust into the spotlight because they can be worn and used underneath PPE, providing staff with a unique tool when caring for COVID patients. This slide for me is very sobering, and it unfortunately, I think, tells the tale of the impact COVID is having on patients, hospitals, and staff. You see a nurse fully gowned in an isolation room, and the message being held up says, "Just going to hold his hand for a bit. I don't think he has long." Well, here's a nurse who, because of issues related to potential device contamination, is forced to resort to using signs or writing on the glass wall of the ICU in order to communicate. It's sad, it's dangerous. This nurse has essentially been left on an island alone and isolated. I enlisted my daughter to illustrate this next point. She's a nurse at a major East Coast academic medical center, and here you can see her wearing typical PPE, barrier protection for eyes, mouth, hands, and clothing. But here's a woodcut from 1721, the plague doctor of Marseille, with barrier protection for eyes, mouth, hands, and clothing. So sure, our protection today is certainly better than it was in the 16 and 1700s, but really the improvements have been rather incremental. And if that's not bad enough, even with modern PPE, the self-contamination rate when doffing or removing the PPE is very significant. And so the less you have to gown up, the better off you are. What's missing from this picture? Modern communication equipment. I'd like you to think about other first responders like the police or firefighters. Do they go into harm's way without a means of communicating with their team members? No. Yet that's exactly what we're asking of our physicians and nurses who can't bring communication devices into isolation rooms due to the risk of contamination. When you isolate your patients, there is no need to simultaneously isolate the staff caring for them. Communications are too important to cut staff members off from their colleagues. The flow of information is key to a smart hospital. Typically, nurses in isolation rooms either remove their PPE and risk self-contamination or hold up signs like the prior slide if they need to communicate with other staff members. The Vocera badges, however, can be worn underneath PPE, giving hands-free access to the staff member for all of their communication needs, keeping them in the loop, part of communications and part of the team. Your staff shouldn't have to risk contamination in order to have communication. Keep your staff safe and don't abandon them. Keep them in the chain of communications so that they can remain an active part of the information transfer process, so crucial for smart hospitals. Similarly, the hospital is a dangerous place and not just for patients. The incidence of both verbal and physical threats directed at physicians and nurses is staggering. And I'll mention this because this occurred yesterday at the hospital where my wife works. One of her colleagues was assaulted by a patient and ended up in the emergency room. Please take a moment and consider, what is your organization doing to address workplace violence? We have a quick audience poll. Roshni, if you wouldn't mind, please. So you can choose as many as apply, but what is your organization doing to address workplace violence? And we'll see the results. So strict visitor protocols, followed by panic button in the patient rooms, and actually a fair percent with mobile panic buttons. That's terrific. All right. So there we go. All right. So the Vocera badges not only keep the staff connected through communications, they also feature a dedicated duress or panic button. When the button's depressed, the phone silently switched into a mode where the microphones will pick up all the conversations in the local environment and will alert security personnel. The staff member can be located based on the access points the badge is connected to. So here are just a few examples of what that's meant. At the State University of New York, upstate, they cut the average security response time from 3.2 minutes to 1 minute. Niagara Health found a decrease in the number of people injured due to aggressive incidents, and Toronto East reduced the security response time from 2.5 minutes to 1 minute. Now, what other types of benefits can you expect to accomplish with a CC&C suite and a smart hospital? Whether it's a reduction in the number of patients who left without being seen from the emergency room, or an improvement in the responsiveness of police, or an improvement in staff satisfaction. Other hospitals have documented a reduction in alarm fatigue, an improvement in throughput, and a reduction in fall-related injuries. But these are just a few of the many examples, which can be viewed on our website, examples of the benefits of a CC&C collaboration system. To wrap up, the authors of the recent JAMA article had some very pragmatic recommendations as part of their conclusions. Hospitals striving for resiliency should implement changes in technologies that have value no matter the current challenges like COVID, changes that will have value even during normal operational times. And among the recommended systems for consideration, systems which coordinate care within and across hospitals, i.e. a clinical communication and collaboration platform. Smart hospitals shorten the time to act by efficiently recognizing and sharing new clinical and operational information, leveraging digital technologies and a modern communication collaboration platform. Now, as was mentioned briefly at the beginning, much, if not all of the information I covered may be found in the recent publication listed on this slide. And additional information is, of course, available on our website. And with this, I thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cantor. That was an extremely well described application of an essential technology for today's environment. We have quite a number of questions that have come in, and I'll just perhaps remind the participants that if you have questions, you can just type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I'll maybe start with the question that came in from a registrant prior to the program being presented. And the question is, given the evolution of Ontario health teams, how can this technology be leveraged by all partners on a team? Community-based services haven't been funded for this aspect of it. And yet I think what this listener participant has identified is the opportunity for the extension of this technology into other settings.
Yeah, it's a very perceptive question because the implication is that communication shouldn't be siloed into one location. If I make a phone call and I call my mother across the US, I don't have to know which kind of phone system, her smartphone is working on. I can just pick up my phone, dial the number, and I get her. Yet with secure text messaging, it doesn't work that way, right? I can pick up my Vocera device, send a text message, but it can't send it. You can't have efficient two-way communications with Tiger Text or with Telmetic or other systems that are out there. They're siloed. That's a problem. Next problem, you want to move your communications both inside and outside the hospital. It does you no good to keep all of your communications sequestered inside the four walls of a building. So you need to spread out, and you need to spread out ideally, not just locally within your own hospital system, but throughout the region so that physicians and patients can share information. It's a difficult problem. You can do it with standard telephony. It's very difficult to do with text messaging because there is no one accepted standard for secure text messaging. So while we have an ability to send information into third-party systems, so for example, we can send a message into Epic, we cannot have the full two-way communications that one would normally expect to have through communication systems. There is an ability to link multiple different campuses together so that you have one gold standard general directory that gives you information about all of the providers. And that can be shared, and that is standard these days. But trying to communicate among a large environment, which is using multiple different systems, remains a challenge for everyone. I think the expectation, however, is from physicians and nurses, eventually there's got to be some kind of process, whether it's a clearinghouse or whatever, in order to share that information. So thank you for that question. I'm not sure I answered it for you, but.
Oh, I think you've very nicely explicated the contextual challenges that we will all be facing in the future in trying to address and facilitate that. The next question, I think is somewhat similar with a bit of a different orientation. The individual says clinical staff have expressed significant challenges with distributed care models in providing team-based care. What strategies help to enable clinical staff to adopt this communication tool so they adapt and adopt to this significant change in their daily work?
Yeah, it was a major issue. As a matter of fact, prior to opening the facility, once the staff made the decision to move to a distributed model, and that was led by our chief nursing executive. So this was a nursing-led executive, a nursing-led process. So that helped, right? From a change management standpoint, you had a nursing leader leading this new nursing model for us, because at our old facility before we moved, it was standard, central nursing stations. There were some assumptions that were made that actually had to be sort of brought back after we went live, because it's one thing to plan for distribution of personnel. It's another thing to make it actually work. Part of the strategy that enabled it to work was consideration of communications. Number two, putting a nurse in charge of the nursing communications. So the person who was representing the nursing staff when that building went live with the new technology standards was one of their own nursing informatics folks reporting to the chief nursing officer, co-reporting back into informatics. So the nurses on the floor weren't dealing with some anonymous IT person that they had never met. They were dealing with one of their own. And it wasn't me, it wasn't a physician, it was a nurse. And I think that that was very important. There was also recognition that to do this model, we were so concerned about this model, we actually brought in a team of ethnologists from UCSD who came in and studied the design and studied the work process, because nurses work as team members. They don't work individually. And they were very concerned with this model, to be quite transparent. They weren't sure how it was going to work. And it was early in this hospital design phase, but hospitals now, at least in the US, are very, very commonly built with this methodology. It's become certainly more the standard than the exception. And I think it just has to do, if nothing else, with the fact that you no longer have a need for large centralized stations when you don't have all of your charts in one location, you don't have all your information in one location. Your information is just as distributed as your physical staff are. But it's not an easy challenge, particularly when you start talking about nurse-patient assignments. I won't get into the details there. I'm no expert on nurse-patient assignment, but you can imagine in a very long sort of linear hospital like our hallways are, you don't want to have a nurse have to run from one end of one of those hallways a quarter of a mile away to see the next patient. So it definitely poses challenges. I won't minimize that.
Thank you for that, Dr. Cantor. I think the expression of the realistic challenges that are faced are really important to identify. One question from Sophia. What are the risks related to privacy, such as when the device picks up voice or personal information, and how are these mitigated?
So I believe then the reference would be to these voice-activated devices. So we have two badges. One is activated by voice and one isn't. In order to activate the one, you have to say, "Okay, Vocera," and it has to be you saying it. It can't pick up anything from the ambient environment because the microphones only go there. We have the patents on this, but the microphones only pick up voice from the person who's speaking right above them. So they really don't hear anything in the environment, and they can't be turned on by anything in the environment. And if they do, it's a very loud, you get a response from the badge that says, "Okay, I'm listening, I'm doing something." So there is no passive listening. It is not an Alexa device that is searching and listening for all sorts of information. We have one or two key phrases, and that's all that it's listening for. And it's basically a variation on "Okay, Vocera." Nothing else is brought in.
Right. I know that while you were making your presentation, you actually activated my Google for some reason, and I have no idea why.
Yes, I wish I had that power remotely, but yeah, I don't know how I did that either.
Another question along this same vein. How is patient confidentiality managed? Example, if a nurse is in another patient room while being contacted about another patient.
Yes, no, a very good point. So I didn't go into all the functionality of the badge, but for example, the smart badge, if you simply lift it up to your ear, it goes into a silent handset mode and functions just like a telephone. So there is no, there's no speaker that is communicating into the outside environment. Similarly, there's a button press on the smaller, older device that does the same thing and puts it into handset mode. Or you can simply tap it and say that you're not going to take the call. So the call comes in, it says it's a patient's call. You can say, you can refuse it without having to touch it. A third option is you can actually transfer the call from your device to one of your cabled standard phones that are on a tabletop anywhere in the room.
Excellent. I think you just presciently responded to the next question as well, which was building on the previous one. Extremely insightful to have the JAMA article identify the importance of that interoperability and communication. Can you say a little bit more about how COVID has impacted the technology deployment overall in hospitals, or ultimately how it has provided insights for what future developments may be opportune?
I can't speak for hospitals in Canada. I can tell you that in the United States, hospitals tend to be counterpunchers. Hospitals tend to realize what's lacking and invest in it based on an event having taken place. Hospitals have enough drain on capital for all sorts of other things. When you're trying to balance, I need a new operating microscope versus repairing a roof versus, improving elevator service, it's all capital equipment. It's all taking the same dollars. And what happened with COVID is it exposed communication issues within hospitals. I wish I could say otherwise, but the past 2 years have been the busiest 2 years for our company in our corporate history. Why? Because the demand for our solutions ramped up so quickly from hospitals that suddenly realized they didn't have effective care team communications. They didn't have an effective way to protect their care team members when they were in isolation and provide them with communication so they weren't isolated. And so the past 2 years has forced companies like ours to, number one, figure out new, faster, efficient, more effective ways of implementing technologies like ours remotely, because the hospitals, we couldn't have our staff implement in person in many cases. It also forced us to adopt new ways of implementing. So for example, if your hospital had an emergency room and you're setting up a triage tent outside and you wanted to ensure constant communications between all the members functioning in the triage area as well as inside the hospital, we could come out into a new facility like that and set up a full wireless hands-free communication capability in less than a week. Well, we never really had that work case, that impetus to develop that program before COVID. So COVID has really forced a recognition from hospitals that communication isn't something to be taken for granted. It is a clinical care tool, and it is important to keep staff members in communication with each other. And it's not just with the care team members, it's also with the patients. Think about patients that had to be cared for in areas of hospitals or in other facilities that weren't designed for patient care and didn't have nurse call systems, as an example. We had some very clever hospitals that leveraged our badges and sort of, if you will, I'll use the word taped. They taped them like to the patient's bed or to a care pole. And we would set up the system so that from outside the room, a nurse could, if you will, audio beam in, talk to the patient could respond. It was all hands-free, and it allowed staff members to have, to ensure patient communication, whether the patient was in isolation or whether the patient was even in the immediate hospital facility itself. We could use a third-party building as long as it was networked appropriately.
Excellent. So very, very insightful examples. I might also mention that Dr. Cantor's colleague in Toronto, John Elias, is also on this call. And I'd just like to encourage John, if he has any comments or observations that he'd like to add to the discussion, please feel free, John, to join in. Let me move on to the next question. Maybe talk, and you've talked a little bit about actually you've provided us with some good insights on communication challenges during the pandemic. And the location of the badge on an IV pole is absolutely innovative in dealing with a situational challenge. Are there other kinds of communication challenges that arose during the pandemic that would be of interest for us to be aware of?
Well, yeah. So the one that immediately comes to mind is communicating underneath PAPRs, communicating when you have a pressured air device because of the noise that the air exchange creates internally. We had actually designed in the under PPE purpose for the device because it could be worn underneath someone who's gowned and gloved in a procedure, or a nurse could wear that underneath their gowning. But we hadn't really designed it for the kind of noise that would be experienced by somebody wearing a powered air purifying filtering device. And so we ended up having, we did a quick innovation sprint on that. And came up with, and I may be wrong, I think we're currently calling it the PPE mode. It changes the way, the frequency response and the directions and things having to do with the microphones that minimizes the impact of the surrounding white noise and improves the ability of the device to respond to voiced commands. We also rapidly implemented an improved way to link the badges to Bluetooth, so that if you wanted to wear Bluetooth, you could do that. And that also helped to mitigate a lot of the noise. So from a communications challenge, that was one. The rapid need to set up communications for things like triage tents was a second. And the third, I would say, if we had our VP of implementation here, was how to do this sort of implementation remotely.
Yeah, a challenge that you never could have predicted other than under the circumstances.
No, but some of those changes will persist. You know, you learn new skills, you get proficient in new abilities. And so some of that will not go away.
No, and we'll be well prepared for the next pandemic. In your illustration, you identified the inputs, the platform, and then the outputs. And you identified nurse, other clinicians, other healthcare team members. What isn't identified in that illustration is the patient.
Yep.
And in Canada, through the Health Standards Organization and through Accreditation Canada and initiatives of the Canadian College of Health Leaders have put a real emphasis on trying to identify ways in which we can ensure that the patient is very much involved in the delivery of care that takes place, and they aren't necessarily passive. So, you know, development of checklists, for example, of what they might expect from a hip replacement, etc. Any thoughts about whether that would be an appropriate function to add?
So we actually can do some of that functionality. I simply didn't point it out on the platform overview because it's rather broad. We have other offerings that specifically talk to things like how do you push out preoperative information? How do you do your pre-op screening? How do you provide post-discharge information to the patient, audio recordings, things like that. We have another solution that is called Vocera Ease. Ease is, the first time I saw it, I was truly amazed. I've been doing innovation in healthcare for 20 years. This was originally a simple solution started by a couple of cardiothoracic pediatric anesthesiologists in Florida. And it was something that they were drawn to do because of a patient they were caring for, and the family wanted to be kept in the loop as their child was going through heart surgery. They ended up developing a really wonderful solution that provides full texture communication between the hospital staff and the family or friends of the patient. It's done in a HIPAA compliant way. It's done in an easy way that minimizes the challenges for the staff. And the patient or the patient's advocate is the one who determines who should be the recipient of information. And so, very simply, the hospital, the nurse, the physician can send a message, a photo, a video, and it goes to all of those folks that are caring for that patient, whether inside the hospital or their family and friends outside the hospital. As far as connecting the patient directly into the system, we are moving directly into that direction. Now, some of the EHR vendors do that through what they call their patient portal. But we need to be able to speak to the patients and do that in a secure manner, just as much as we are able to speak about them. And so that is an area that we are actually working on.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We have a question here from Samuel. And the question, what is the possibility and the ability of the device in handling multiple communication coming in at the same time?
Yeah, so that's handled like any other system. We actually, in a demo, can show that. And what happens if you're on a call and you're busy? So for example, let's say a call comes in, things are automatically routed. That's part of what the escalation pattern determines. If someone is not available and someone doesn't pick up a message or cannot pick up a call, where does that subsequently go? So if I'm receiving text messages is not really the issue because asynchronous communications come in all the time. You could get 4 or 5 text messages in a row. In our system, those come to the inbox and they can be sorted either by priority, by urgency, or they can be sorted by the time in which they've come in. And so whether you're using a smart device, one of our badges, or you're using a phone, you can either see or have the device tell you the messages that have come in order. So, for example, the badges can do text to voice. They'll read you a text message that comes in. The bigger device, what we call our smart badge, actually has a touch sensitive screen on it. So not only can you do voice to text for responding with a text message, you can also type a text message if you like. So the communications is not disrupted by having multiple different systems coming in at the same time.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the string of questions that have come in, Dr. Cantor. It's my pleasure to thank you so very much for spending the morning with us, and with John as well and Roshni for organizing the event for us. So in respect to the dissemination of the information, we're delighted with the sponsored article, and we would encourage our readership to, if they wish, get more detail in that fashion. And I know that Roshni will also be posting this video for other college members to see if they weren't able to catch this session. So again, thank you very, very much for your presentation, and best wishes. And I look forward to my next round of golf at Torrey Pines.
Next time you're in town, please let me know. Don, Roshni, thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate it.